Hello, welcome to the Energy Question with David Blackman. I'm your host, David Blackman, and my very special guest today is Daniel Yergin, the Vice Chairman of S&P Global and author of The New Map and a couple of previous books that are just fantastic. The Quest and for me, the greatest book ever written on the oil and gas industry and its history, The Prize. Dan, how are you today?
Fine, glad to be back with you.
Well, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. Talking about your books, I recently, in preparation for this, went back and watched the documentary that you produced back in the late 1990s, I think it was, for the History Channel on the Prize. And gosh, I can't recommend that highly enough for folks who may not have time to read the book, to watch that documentary if you want to learn the history of the oil and gas business and the impacts it's had on the world. So,
Thank you, David. And I do have it on my YouTube channel. I don't know where you found it, but
I found it on YouTube, actually.
good.
Yeah.
So it was amazing. It was amazing to take a book that one had worked on for 7 years and turned it into an 8-hour
Yeah.
narrative, fast-paced television show. Learned a lot doing it and conveyed a lot of the really.
It did. It conveyed an awful lot of what was in the book. Obviously, not everything, but just fantastic work. I know right now, before we get into questions, I know you are right in the middle of getting ready for your annual CERAWEEK conference in Houston. I wanted to just give you a chance to talk about how that's going and what the agenda is going to look like.
Well, it's been a very dramatic year for the energy industry. So much has changed, everything from the war in Ukraine to the IRA Act in the United States. And of course, we've seen some political changes in the United States as well. So I think the basic theme is trying to capture how companies and others navigate what has become a much more turbulent and confusing energy picture, and setting it in the political and geopolitical as well as economic context.
Yeah, it has been one of the most amazing years I've ever seen in the energy space, and of course, the Russia's invasion of Ukraine upset everything related to energy and the geopolitics that surround it. And so, yes, I imagine the conference is going to just be an amazing event this year.
Right.
How many people typically attend CERAWEEK?
Well, we expect 6,000. There's the executive conference, and then we call it the Agora, which is really about technological innovation, ingenuity, which showcases new technologies all across the energy spectrum, from oil and gas to renewables, electric power. So it's really sort of two conferences in one.
Yeah.
Split between the two of them. I think another basic theme is there, and something that's really happened over the last year, is the return of energy security, which had pretty much fallen off the table, partly in the United States because of the success of the shale revolution. Maybe you'll remember, I think it's 7 or 8 US presidents used to talk about becoming energy independent, and it seemed, oh, well, that's just a campaign slogan, it'll never happen. And then lo and behold, over a decade or so, the US became energy independent, and that's had big economic impact, and it's had a big geopolitical impact, but it also meant that people no longer thought, a lot of people just sort of forgot, a lot of political leaders forgot about energy security, but that sure is back on the table today.
So you were recently at the World Economic Forum conference in Davos, where there was an awful lot of discussion about energy and the energy transition and plans from other countries and how they're going to meet their goals. We didn't have a chance to talk about this the last time you were with me, and so I want to focus a lot on this energy transition. I wonder, just to start, in your view, is the transition proceeding at the pace that's needed to get to this net zero by 2050 goal that the global community has set?
Well, there's a lot of language about that, but it's interesting, first of all, that one thing I puzzle over, the goal is net zero by 2050, but China's goal is net zero by 2060,
Yeah.
and India's goal is net zero by 2070. And right there, you're talking a couple of other countries like that, you're talking about like 40% of emissions. So
Yeah.
I just have trouble, I struggle with, wait, 2016, 2070 are not the same as 2050. I think that, the direction towards decarbonization is there, but one of the things I did in the new map, and this is a part of the book I would really recommend to people, is reading the section on energy transition, because that term gets thrown around as though this transition just continues what happened since, January 1709, in which, at least in the new map, I argued the energy transition began from wood to coal for industrial purposes, making iron. But this is entirely different. Those unfolded over a century or more, and the other energy didn't disappear. Oil took number one place from coal in the 1960s, and today the world uses 3 times as much coal, and 2022 was the highest use of coal ever. So this energy transition is a really different thing, which is to say, in a quarter century, you're going to change the energy foundation of $100 trillion world economy
Yeah.
that today is over 80% hydrocarbons. That's a really big deal.
It is. It's a huge deal. And coal was going to replace wood, right? And last year, didn't the world use a record amount of wood, burn a record amount of wood for energy?
Yeah, I think it did. And in the developing world, people are burning a lot of wood and waste. And for like 1 billion or more people in the world, energy transition means moving from wood to LPG, liquid petroleum gas.
Yeah.
In other words, that's their energy transition, which is really different from the energy transition, say, in Denmark.
Right. Yeah, and so it seems to me, I have to agree with you. It seems to me we are so far anyway having more of an energy addition rather than any sort of real transition. I mean, it's like we need more of everything.
Yeah, I think that, but one of the other themes, and I emphasize this in the new map, and I really have felt this over the last few months, this north-south divide, where there's one perspective on energy transition, say in Western Europe and North America. It's pretty different in the developing world, where per capita incomes might be 1/20th or 1/40th the level of people living in Brussels, where the European Union is. And there, for them, it's about economic growth. And so climate may be a priority, but so is economic growth, reducing poverty, improving health. And it's just such a different perspective. And this is being played out every day, this kind of north-south divide. And we could see, I think, at these UN COP meetings that have been occurring, that this is emerging as a bigger and bigger issue. I should add, we're doing a project called Energy Asia with a group of ASEAN, that is Southeast Asian countries, and they want their voice to be heard on energy uses too. They want to use natural gas to replace coal, for instance. That's a very different kind of agenda that you might hear in other parts of the world. And this return of energy security is really quite a change, because European countries were very close to saying natural gas isn't acceptable. And now you have the Chancellor of Germany flying off to Senegal and Qatar and Canada, trying to find additional liquefied natural gas, additional LNG. So when security issues come to the fore, when prices go up, when there are threats about supply, the perspective changes.
Yes, and it has to. One of the things I watch Fox Business in the morning. I get up very early, and Maria Bartiromo's on, and you had an interview with Miss Bartiromo while you were in Davos, in which you talked about the critical energy mineral piece of all of this. And I've written so much about that myself over the last 2 years. Do you think Western governments really are going to do what's necessary to mine for these minerals? I mean, we in the West, we pretty much got out of the hard rock mining business about 40 years ago when China began to emerge and kind of assume a lead in all of that. And I mean, is the United States going to suddenly start approving permits for new hard rock mining ventures now to facilitate the minerals needs of electric vehicles and renewable energy?
Well, this almost unprecedented IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, it's also a Compete with China Act,
Yeah,
has provisions to encourage domestic mineral content or from quote friendly nations. But I think you pointed to a problem in the US, and it's something really when we were just working on our big recent copper study, it became clear around the world wherever you talk, permitting is a really big issue. And in the United States, it's a really, really big issue
yeah.
to get anything done. Uh, US copper production has declined by half over the last couple of decades. And I was just reading that another big mining project was rejected on environmental grounds, or you get this kind of endless kind of litigation struggle, regulatory struggle that goes on. So I think that there's a gap between aspiration and ability to implement. And yet, one of the things about the shift energy transition is supposed to be a shift towards much greater electrification. That requires a lot of minerals. And as you point out, David, China has a pretty dominating role in the global mineral supply.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, China just last week, I think it was, the Bolivian government entered into agreement with a big Chinese mining company to develop its resources in the lithium triangle. That enormous series of salt flats in South America. And so now China has this foothold in the lithium triangle. China's not going to stand still and just allow America and other governments of the West to build all these alternative supply chains for these minerals, right?
In fact, it's really catch up. The Chinese started, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago,
Yeah,
very strategically going out to play dominant roles in mineral supply, and their companies do not have the same shareholder pressure that a Western company does. So their economics are different. So you see, for instance, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, big copper mine was owned by a US company, it's now owned by a Chinese company. China processes 42%, I think it is, of copper. In 80% of the lithium ion batteries more or less pass through China. So there's kind of this effort now, well, let's build them, build in the United States or elsewhere. And there's a real scramble going on, but China starts off in a very strong position and doesn't have the same constraints.
yeah.
I didn't know about the Bolivian project. Certainly, if you look at Chinese investment in Latin America, it's really growing.
Oh, yes. Yes. I mean, they're really moving in there in a big way. You mentioned copper a moment ago. And of course, Chile is, I think, the world's largest producer of copper. I interviewed your folks at S&P Global when they completed that study last summer on the future of copper demand and supply. And at that time, they were telling us that we were going to have to globally copper supply would need to somehow triple, I think, by
Double.
about double by
But
2033.
yeah,
Yeah. So I Elon Musk the other day, and I'm a big fan of Mr. Musk, so I'm not bashing him here. But he put out a tweet in which he said that no change in copper supply is needed to facilitate the energy transition. Uh, uh, that's not an accurate statement, is it? I mean, we're going to need a lot more copper, aren't we?
I wonder. I mean, what is he assuming? There's going to be an amazing amount of recycling. I'm not sure how we get to
Well,
that
maybe
number.
so. Maybe
Yeah,
that's what the
I mean,
assumption there is.
but it is obviously there are real constraints on growing supply because copper is a lot of it is concentrated in countries that don't like mining. The governments don't like mining, such as Chile, which, as you point out, produces 25% of the world's copper, or Peru is another significant producer where you don't really have a government right now, but the government
Right.
has been rather hostile to it. So doubling production seems really difficult. Recycling would be part of the answer. The other would be innovation. But an electric car uses 2.5 times more copper. And copper is known as Dr. Copper because it predicts demand and economic cycles. And Dr. Copper is perking up recently. Price
Yeah.
has gone up, suggesting that, I mean, generally the economic view is less pessimistic than it was a few months ago, suggesting that we're going to have growth. And of course, China is reopening haphazardly very quickly, and that's going to drive up demand. And so, some people say, well, price will lead to more mining. But it takes 16 to 25 years to open a major new, what's called tier 1 mine. Part of it is that permitting, and that's like a $6 billion commitment. So you have to have a lot of confidence to go, lay down $6 billion on something that's going to unfold over 16 or 25 years. And you don't know how many times that government is going to change.
Right. Yeah. In the United States, it's like we change governments every 4 years now. I've written, I covered a lot of this, the lithium question, and I've written about a miner called Pioneer that is attempting to open up the Rhyolite Ridge mine in Western Nevada. And has been, you talk about the permitting issues. They've been trying now for 10 years to get all their permits in place. And for the last 3 years, that mine has been held up by a challenge from the Center for Biological Diversity in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service over a plan to protect 10 acres of buckwheat that CBD claims is an endangered subspecies of buckwheat that is adjacent to the mine. And I mean, I think what people need to understand is that when you have permits being held up by the federal government in the United States, it's almost always due to the provisions that are in these big major environmental statutes, the National Energy Policy Act and others. I wonder if you think the public in the United States is going to accept a proposition that says we're going to speed up permitting for mining operations like these by amending the Endangered Species Act to make its provisions less onerous, because that's really what would have to happen, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't know. I was in a discussion with with people, including from the mining industry, and they're just talking about two things that regulators who are sort of immobilized in terms of making decisions because of all the different pressures and so forth. And then even once a decision's made, you go into this litigation marathon that never ends because there's some people who just don't want it done. And you go from court to court, find reasons. We're right now a federal court is going to review a decision by a state agency in Virginia that would allow the last 6% of the Mountain Valley pipeline to be built.
Yeah.
$3 billion natural gas pipeline. Now it's probably a $6 billion pipeline. And the regulatory administrative state and the litigation process, it's just getting the last 6% done. And it just, that doesn't seem to end. Senator Manchin and others have tried to introduce legislation to improve the permitting process and to put a time limit on it. So the time is not infinite, but it's a struggle getting that legislation. It was promised as part of the last Congress. It didn't see the light of day. So we'll see this Congress, but there is a contradiction between the ambitions and aspirations on one side and the fact that you need real stuff. You don't just do it with the sun and the winds. You need real stuff, concrete, steel, and lots of minerals in order to implement these aspirations.
Yeah, I was telling a friend the other day that the reality of all this is that the renewable energy and electric vehicles are every bit as mineral intense. Their needs are every bit as mineral intense as any other form of energy, and people
or more
just
so, or more
or
so.
most so, yeah,
And it's, it's interesting. I did a CERAWEEK conversation. It's interesting, with the head of the Renewable Energy Association and the head of the American Petroleum Institute. And you would think there'd be a lot of things they didn't agree on, but the one thing they really agreed on is permitting is a real problem in the
yeah,
United States, whether it's mining, whether it's access to federal lands. And by the way, most people don't know this, but the federal government owns about 48% of the Western United States. I mean,
yeah,
it's not like everything. It owns a lot of land. And under the 1920 Mineral Act, it's supposed to uh, make the land economically productive, uh, whether it's bringing offshore wind cables onshore. It's all permitting, and our system just doesn't allow it. I chaired a session last year at CERAWEEK with a number of senior U.S. government officials and industry, just discussing the permitting problem around renewables of all things. And one of the people there was the CEO of Electricity de France, EDF, which actually is a big investor in U.S. wind. And he listened to this discussion and said, I do not understand, why is it not just that you just go to the government, make a decision, and it gets done? And I said to him, with all due respect, sir, you need to take a course on constitutional law to understand why it's so hard to get these things done
yeah,
in the United States.
yeah.
I mean, I just, David, if we were trying to do the interstate highway system today, it wouldn't get permitted.
Yeah. About 20 years ago, I led a committee in a study on natural gas in 2003 through uh, the National Petroleum Council that had been asked for by the Secretary of Energy, and our committee was looking at these access issues on federal lands, and the finding in our study was that roughly 30% of federal lands are simply off limits, simply due to conditions of approval for permitting and permitting. I mean, there's just 30% of federal lands 20 years ago that you simply couldn't do anything on because of all the restrictions to access. And that's only grown over the last 20 years. So I can't even imagine what a similar study might find.
Yeah, I think it would find it's even more restrictive and more opposition. But I think another thing that people just don't understand is what a big landowner the U.S. government is. I mean, it owns almost half of Western United States.
Yeah, even in the Permian Basin, in the New Mexico portion of the Permian Basin, one of the most richest parts of that play. The federal government owns almost half that land in Lee and Eddy County in New Mexico, and it's a very interesting conundrum. I just think it's almost unsolvable, really, because you would have to have Congress make these big amendments to these very important statutes.
Yeah. It would take. I would use that word reform. They really need to be reformed, because that was not the original intention of these acts.
Yeah.
But that's the way that they've been implemented over time.
Right. Yes. I completely. Anyway, we could talk for hours about just that.
Well, I'll just say that, I mean, you say permitting and people's eyes glaze over, but it is a huge stumbling block in whatever direction you want to go in energy.
It is, and it's really central to the whole discussion. You mentioned China reopening, and of course that is increasing demand for crude. Prices have gone up recently as a result. One of the big events in this energy crisis that's taken place in recent months was the sanction on Russian crude and the price cap that the United States and Europe attempted to implement. And I also today wanted to get your view on how successful that policy has been or not been.
Yeah, it's been this to just explain it. For the essence of it is that the EU passed, the European Union and the UK passed laws last spring, saying that you will not be able, come December 5th of last year, to import Russian seaborne crude that comes by tanker in Western Europe. Western Europe has been a major market for Russian oil. So they wanted to cut off Putin's revenues that he's going into his war. The problem was that if that oil didn't flow somewhere, you'd have a shortage and prices would go up and Russia would benefit. So the US government came up with this very idea, which sounded at first like something that just economists would think of, but it actually seems to work, to put a price cap on Russian oil, saying that the Russian oil, you can, if you're a tanker company or oil trader, you can buy Russian oil and ship it as long as it's under $60 a barrel. And what's that done? These combined things is to really constrain the market for Russian oil. So it's now gone, a lot of it's now going to India, which was not a buyer at all. And the price is much lower. It's been as low as $37 or $40 a barrel. So in fact, it has, to the surprise of many, it's worked, and it is Russian oil. The budget for Russian oil is pegged in the budget at $70 a barrel. So if they're getting $37 or $40, they're getting less money. So it has worked, but it's also led to kind of a partitioning of the world oil market. What was a global market is certainly no longer a global market. People don't know the U.S. was importing 700,000 barrels a day of a particular type of Russian product to make our refiners more efficient. That's all over. So it's a very interesting kind of development that it's worked. The question that's coming up now is a similar ban and a similar price cap for Russian products like diesel. Excuse me, I have a cat.
Right.
Got to get the cat out of it. Should we let me pushing her away, and then let's do it again.
I have a cat of my own. I love it when they do that.
Yeah. So she really likes the keyboard.
Yeah.
What she'll do is disconnect us. So I got to keep her away. But she's my writing buddy. She's helped me write my last couple of books. So I don't want to upset
Well, she
her
does
too much.
good work then. I congratulate her.
I give her a lot of credit, actually, a lot of credit. You know what it's like to writing. Sometimes it's hard to write. It's nice to have a writing buddy. We don't have a global oil market anymore. We had a global oil market until the Ukraine war started, and Russia's role is circumscribed. Now the Russians have stopped. They're the ones who've cut off gas to Europe, but it turned out that Europe has managed to get through this winter better than people had thought.
Yeah.
And that's going to again. So at least at this point, Putin is losing some of his energy leverage, which had been pretty considerable.
Well, that's if Putin's losing leverage, that's probably a good thing for the rest of the world. This bifurcation of the energy market you're talking about. I wonder too, how does that? What are the geopolitical implications of that when it comes to the BRICS alliance? And
well, that's a really important point, because President Biden said that Russia would be a pariah. Russia is a pariah for 34 countries that have put sanctions on.
right.
It's not a pariah for the BRICS country, where Putin is still welcome. The Indian foreign minister was in Moscow a few weeks ago, and he described Russia as a steady and time-tested partner. And so for those countries, and certainly, if anything, it's solidified the Russian-Chinese strategic relationship, although I think the Chinese have to be questioning their confidence in Putin's judgment, since he's so grossly miscalculated. And I don't think the Chinese want to see a big disruption to the world economy because of what it would do to their economies. But you're quite right that the BRICS, as they're called, the major developing countries, they're generally kind of almost neutral here, or as it's given, the Indians sort of said, we still value our relationship with Russia.
Well, and from just a pure economic standpoint, that alliance seems to me is really almost a rival now in terms just of economic strength and influence. to the G7, right? And if they should add Saudi Arabia, which there's been talk about, rumors about.
Well, I think the Saudis are sort of, the strategic relationship with Saudi Arabia, despite the strains of recent months, I think is pretty fundamental. But Saudi Arabia too, Saudi Arabia and Russia are the two leaders of OPEC plus, and so they have a relationship, become an important relationship with Russia, although their most important relationship with the United States. But remember, the United States really is not a buyer of Saudi oil anymore. Saudi oil goes to primarily, has been going to Asia, to India. Now, as cheap Russian oil takes some of their market share away in India, Saudi Arabia is now sending more oil to Europe. But I think a strategic relationship with the U.S. is very strong. But I think what you're getting at is kind of, there is this division in the world in which there is a China-Russia relationship, which is pretty strong. Putin and Xi describe each other as best friends. And I think Russia is going to increasingly become an economic dependency of China, because what Putin has destroyed is his main economic integration was with Europe. That's done. That's over. I don't think the Europeans are going to turn around and start importing large volumes of Russian gas anytime soon. And that's going to leave Putin with a lot of stranded gas.
Yeah. It's such a fascinating way this is all developing, and Putin is really seems to have put himself in a bind that there's no easy way out of at this point.
I think so. There's that famous phrase, when you dug yourself into a hole, stop digging. He keeps digging in a very brutal way with these missile and drone attacks because of the failure of his military. He thought he'd built up this big, powerful, reinvigorated Russian military following the Soviet Union. It turned out so much of it was hollow because there was so much corruption and so much money was stolen.
Yeah. Well, we're running up against time, but I have one more question. Cathy Woods said last week that she's the CEO of ARK Invest, for those who don't know, that she believes that the crude demand globally could fall by as much as 30% just in the next 5 years as a result of all this action around the energy transition. Do you think there's really a chance that could happen in such a short period of time?
Well, I certainly, in the new map, look very carefully at demand. It's something that we do on a regular basis at S&P, and I just don't think that's so at all. I think oil demand is going to continue to grow into 2030 and perhaps then, and it's going to continue to require investment because you have decline, 4-6% decline in fields, so you're going to need to reinvest. And if you have economic growth, the demand growth is going to be driven by the developing world, where, by the way, 80% of the world's people live. So I just pretty amazed. I wouldn't know where that 30% came from.
I don't either, but anyway, I just had to ask that question.
Yeah, that's a new one to me.
Me too.
I mean, there is a question about peak demand for oil,
right,
and when it's going to peak, but 30% decline. Just all of the constraints we're talking about, electric cars and so forth, and we have a 1.5 billion car global fleet. So right. Even if you sell electric cars and the shares go up, that's the overall number is so large. So I think the world is going to continue to need a lot of energy if it's going to maintain economic growth.
Well, Dan, I can't thank you enough for this. These conversations go so fast, and I just love being able to talk with you every once in a while. And I hope we can do it again in the future.
Absolutely, and I appreciate it too, David. And, I'm very interested to look at your writings on lithium.
Well, thank you, and I do plan to once I have the transcript of this to write up a Forbes story and And so I will be sure and send you a link when
Great.
that is published as well.
Good. Well, thank you. A pleasure to be with you again, and we'll continue the conversation.
My pleasure, and best of luck with CERAWEEK.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And that's all for the energy question today, folks. Thank you for joining us. Bye.